Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The beginnings of a new vision for transportation in Memphis, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Suzanne Carlson from Innovate Memphis and working on transportation issues for Memphis 3.0. Thank you for being here. Glenn Gadbois handles transportation issues for the Memphis Medical District Collaborative. Thank you for being here. Scudder Wag is a transportation consultant with Jarrett Walker, working with the Memphis 3.0 people, along with Bill Dree, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. So this week, you all will have rolled out, we're actually taping this on Monday, but on Tuesday you'll have rolled out the final recommendations for Memphis 3.0 transit issues to the City Council. We'll have written about that and things will be online. But we'll talk generally about it, and I want to start real high level, actually, and I'm going to look at you, Suzanne, because you've worked on transportation issues with Innovate Memphis for some years now, deeply involved in the Memphis 3.0, and we'll talk more about that, components. But just for everyone, and from your perspective, the challenges and maybe the opportunities of transportation issues in Memphis right now. And what are we talking about when we talk about transportation? We're not just talking about buses, we're talking about a whole range of issues.
Right, well, through the Memphis 3.0 comprehensive planning process, which is being run by the city, they did a lot of community outreach and found that one thing that was coming up in really every community was transportation issues, in this case specifically transit. The fact that we don't have enough transit to get people to day-to-day opportunities in Memphis. There's other transportation issues, possibly potholes, bike lanes, there's a whole gamut, but we've really focused on transit as being a high-level issue to solve here because of the frequency with which it came up during that process. So Innovate Memphis got involved as part of Memphis 3.0 to run the Transit Vision project, and we contracted with Jarrett Walker and Associates to look at our transit network that we have today and kind of reassess it and say, is this still the right plan for Memphis? It's kind of been changed over time with little tweaks to the system here and there, and we wanted to look at it really more holistically and see if it's the right network as well as the right amount of investment that we're making in transit and what could we do to improve it.
I'm going to go to you, Glenn, for maybe a slightly different perspective in the sense that you were just hired, I believe in January, you started with the Memphis Medical District Collaborative, focused on transportation issues. We've had Tommy Pacello, who's the head of Memphis Medical District, which is an effort to kind of renew that whole area around the hospitals down towards downtown, bring residents back in, retail. In part, the Wonder Bread development is in part a byproduct of that. People who've driven around have seen changes to streetscape and more just a kind of beautification project and so on. I was struck, and we covered this a lot at the paper, we've covered these issues a lot on the show, that there would be actually within the Memphis Medical District Collaborative a person just focused on transportation. Why was that so important for the medical district?
But so Eric, you did a beautiful job kind of laying out
thank you.
the entire kind of 360 comprehensive effort that the collaborative does. Part of that work with the anchor institutions, they recognize that there are some transportation challenges that are limiting possibility for the district. As a consequence, they invested in having me and bringing me on and basically a program that works with the employers to help them reorient the deal. The deal is you drive, we'll store your car. That means they have to change policy, benefits, a lot of different stuff for their employees to actually change their behavior. And then we also help their employees to figure out how to change their behavior and what options might work for them. What we know is right now 97% of the employees and students coming into the district travel there driving alone. And
driving alone.
Driving alone. And that means the district has, about 375 acres of parking space for storage of cars. That is slightly larger than Overton Park. It's a huge dedication of space and money to build that out, et cetera. And if you're trying to strengthen that area, it's also unfriendly. It's not pleasant walking by there, right? And so when everybody starts looking at how can we redevelop, how can we bring in kind of new residential, new retail, all that sort of stuff, part of the question is how do you deal with the demand for parking spaces in a different way?
And do I remember just for the scale, that the number of people working in the Memphis Medical District area, it's over 20,000 or something like that?
About 25,000.
That are coming in and out every day, because a very tiny percentage actually live in that area.
Employees and students
right.
coming in there for those
right.
two. That doesn't count patients.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So
and that doesn't count visitors, et cetera. And when we did, and we had this conversation to tie it back, when we looked at the data they were providing and compared it to our where we know employees live, we were seeing only 913 employees or students having access to viable transit.
Right.
And what they're talking about now is generating significantly more transit, which we think can get us up to about 2,500, 10% of employees that could use transit. Yeah. That's a big difference.
Which is a big difference, yeah. Still a small percentage, but a big difference from where it is right
now.
Yeah,
but in my business, you're not shooting for 100%.
Yeah.
You're shooting for 10 or 20% change.
Okay. From your point of view, and again, I'm doing this, some would say a little backwards, but rather than we'll get into the specifics of the 3.0, of what's going on with that. But I'm curious, I love when we get a chance to have somebody who's an outside expert on from other communities, because there can sometimes be in Memphis and in a lot of other communities the sense that we're the only ones who have trouble with our bus system. We're the only ones who don't have the right transit options. Everybody else is doing it right and we're doing it wrong. There can be that sort of self-defeatism about that.
Everyone is struggling with this problem. And particularly southern cities like you are struggling with this problem, but all American cities are struggling with this problem. To Glenn's point about the medical district, 375 acres of parking. The fundamental challenge that most American cities are facing, and cities across the world, is cars take up a lot of space. And cities are places where people have relatively little space per person. And when cars take up a lot of space, both to move and to store, there's less space available for everyone else to have offices, shops, restaurants. You look at, downtown Memphis today versus downtown Memphis in 1960, and their big differences are there are fewer people and activities there, in part because a lot of them have been replaced by surface parking. So, cities over the last 10 to 15 and 20 years have really started to rethink how they want to invest in transportation, because most of the second half of the 20th century, they ignored transit and built entirely around the automobile, because the thinking was that was the answer, that was the new thing. And we've discovered after 50, 60 years of trying that model that it doesn't work for cities, because cities have to be places where people can get together easily in large numbers with very little space. And when you do that, there's just not room for all the cars.
Yeah.
And the answer then are different options: walking, biking, and then transit, because those three things take up the least space per person and get people where they need to go.
Yeah.
So we, and by we I mean our firm, has worked in a lot of places, Richmond, my hometown, being one of them recently, but even cities in Canada we work in that are struggling with this challenge, because we spent so many years not thinking about this holistically.
All right, we'll come back to a lot of that, but let me get Bill Dries involved.
So Scudder, when we talked about this last year, several months ago, the mix that we have here with our bus system is, as I understand it, 60% of it is coverage. You got to have some kind of bus service there. The frequency may not be high, but you got to cover it. The other 40% of our bus mix is high frequency, a lot of trips coming through there. With this draft report, what changes about that?
So to unpack that really quickly for everyone to understand, when our firm takes a very clear approach to thinking about the value trade-offs of transit, and one of the big value trade-offs conflicts is the conflict between designing transit that provides basic access and coverage to as many places as possible, which is what about 60% of your service in Memphis is doing. trying to get to every neighborhood and make sure as many people as possible have service, versus designing for getting as many riders as possible or getting as many people to use the service, where you would concentrate service where you have very frequent service, meaning short waits for transit. Because waiting time is usually the important or the most significant aspect of travel time for riding transit. You know, a lot of routes in the Memphis system run only every hour. So if you just miss the bus, it's a long wait. Mm-hmm. You know, most people who drive daily don't think about how that might affect your life, but it's like you had a gate at the end of your driveway and it only opens once an hour. If you miss that gate opening and you do that 2 or 3 days a week, you're going to lose your job. So concentrating service, any fixed amount of service you have, even if you increase your budget, you're always going to have a fixed amount. That balance between how you spend those dollars makes a big difference in the usefulness of service for people. And yes, if you go and read our Choices report, which we produced last September, the existing system as we analyze it is 40% focused on ridership or frequency and about 60% on coverage. So based on all of the outreach work that we've done around concepts and around that value question, the direction that the city came to was that we should balance it at 70% ridership, 30% coverage, with an additional investment of about $30 million a year in the system. And so that makes a big difference in how much frequent service you can provide. So today, the only frequent service in the closest thing you have to frequent service in the system are the trolley routes and the Poplar route. Everything else runs only every 30 minutes or 60 minutes or worse. The redesigned network, the network that you could start implementing in 3 or 4 years, depending on exactly when you can start investing that additional dollars, has at least 4 high-frequency bus routes that cover large parts of the city and increases job access for the average person by almost 40% in terms of how many jobs you could reach in an hour.
Can we say what those routes are?
Yeah, Union and Poplar, the Airways, Watkins, Cleveland, North-South route, the Cooper, Airways Cooper. I got that confused. Airways Cooper, Presley, Watkins, Cleveland, North-South, Lamar, and then Union into Poplar. So 4 high-frequency routes that cover a large part of the city.
Okay, and you talked about a dollar figure here of $30 million over several years. That funding level, though, is still tentative and is still being discussed, or has the administration signed off on that?
Well, let me jump in since Scudder's really working at the behest of the city and Innovate Memphis. We did pretty robust public outreach. So we did 2 phases of public outreach so far. The first was really conceptual. It just said, would you rather have shorter waits for transit or shorter walks for transit, kind of the ridership and frequency versus coverage trade-off. And then in the second phase, we actually had 4 draft maps. We had the existing system, a way to reallocate the existing dollars into a higher ridership system, and then 2 maps that had additional funds. And in fact, in that case, it was $35 million annual new operating funds in the draft maps that we put out. And we heard from folks, well, if you leave it as is, keep coverage. We don't want anyone to lose out on what they have today, but if we have the opportunity to have more funds, let's get more ridership. Let's make transit more useful and get especially more job access for everyone. So we made the decision, looking at both public input and a stakeholder committee that we have, to design the system to 70% ridership, 30% coverage, really just meaning that the new dollars go to ridership. The base system stays pretty similar, and new dollars go to increasing frequency on the routes that he was talking about. And then the $30 million figure is actually annual. It would include capital and operating. So in the beginning, we need more capital to buy more buses, to make some improvements on the streets where we're going to have a lot of buses, better shelters, transfer points, things like that. And then as we go forward, more for operating. So that was really looking at the information that was coming from the public, the amount of service we need, and kind of what we thought was feasible in terms of the demands we have as a city and where to invest our dollars, that this is what would really be appropriate to raise for transit.
Will there be areas of the city that now have coverage that won't have coverage in this scenario?
So the design of the system, it is a blank slate redesign, meaning we started from a completely blank map to design the network. We did start from a policy point of we want to be sure that anyone that is near a stop today will still be near a stop in the future, within a half mile, quarter mile. Doesn't mean that the stop will be in the same place, or the route will be in the same place, or the route will take you to the exact same route. But we intentionally designed it so that everyone who is near service today is still near service with the redesigned system. Most people are near much better service because we've increased the frequency on so many routes with that additional investment. But that doesn't mean everyone, benefits 40% with better than 40% access. Mm-hmm. So, different parts of the city benefit differently. But when you look at the outcomes, the vast majority of people across the vast majority of the city have significant increases in access to jobs, shopping, all sorts of opportunities with the redesign.
Glenn, in the case of the Memphis Medical District, is the transit need their coverage, or is the transit need their frequency?
So as you would expect, employees come from all over this region, some of which transit will never serve. And so, without a doubt, a lot of people in the medical district are kind of dots on a map that everything that Scudder just said kind of applies to. Some people would lose service if it were cut. Fortunately, it's not. Unfortunately, an hour between buses doesn't work very well for employees getting to work. But the range of times and all of that, are nice improvements. What we do know is that the number of employees, given the high frequency routes, the number of employees that can use transit will greatly increase. And then the other thing we need to still solve, and we're in discussions with Matt about how to do this, is a shuttle over to Harbortown, because a lot of the medical district employees simply aggregate over there. It hasn't ever worked very well for MATA to be able to get transit service there, and they're not charged with expanding the footprint, right? Mm-hmm. And so we will work on how we can get the private sector employers to show proof of concept. And that's one of the things that we ought to put on the table, folks, is private sector can invest in this stuff. Places I've come to before Memphis, they have. There's no reason to expect that it's all a public sector issue.
It's an extreme example, but I mean, I know I've read articles of, Google has buses that go from downtown San Francisco to their campus out in Mountain View, and some of those other high-tech firms. But there are other examples you're saying. It doesn't have to be at Google.
We put together an aggregate of 6 different employers in, basically west downtown Austin that simply wanted to get their employees over 9-10 blocks to connect up with transit, and they were paying the dime for the shuttle.
Yeah. Another example of that is, sometimes it's not just employers, but special events. So in DC, the Washington Nationals will pay sometimes to make sure that the Metro Rail system operates late at night after a late game.
Oh, really?
Right. So all sorts of people can come to the table to help solve some of those issues. Late night when you need a little extra service.
I guess that's no different than an event or a team or something, a parade paying for extra police service.
Exactly.
And that kind of stuff happens all the time, and we don't think twice about it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So there's tons of opportunities for those sorts of partnerships.
Let me come back to you, Suzanne, and you may not know these, but we talked through some of the specifics of the plan. $30 million. Are you all making recommendations at this phase on how that gets paid for, or was that not part of your charge?
That was not part of the charge. We haven't been looking at that so far. We've been looking at what sort of transit investments could help Memphis. So as we go forward, the survey that we're going to have when we have the draft recommended network out, we're asking for public comment on it, so people can look at it and make recommendations whether they like the draft network or they'd recommend some changes. And then we're asking people as well how much they'd be willing to pay. So at this point, we're really taking the temperature. When we did the phase 2 survey, we asked people that question, and it came in around between $5 and $8 was sort of the average. People said they'd be willing to pay per month, per household, for better transit service. And we're asking the same question again. And
do you, what would the rollout? How long would it take to roll out the proposal you guys are making? Money, if money were, let's say, not an option, which it will be, so it's a silly question, but I did it.
Right. We've put a target year of 2022, so enough time to have the public have this conversation around the plan, look at what some funding options might be, and if and when we get funding, we need time to purchase buses, make some improvements, and then change the system out.
Well, to what extent, for all of you with thinking about transit issues, do ride sharing, Uber, Lyft, others that might come along, to what degree does that sort of alter the models of saying, okay, yeah, if we had a really great bus system by 2022, we'd have X history shows, we'd have all these riders, but now we're in this period where more and more but Uber and Lyft are out there moving slowly or rapidly on some level into an age of autonomous cars. How does that change your planning purpose?
Well, in the age of pre-automation, so vehicles that can drive themselves, where you have the primary cost of most any transit service or ride-sharing service or taxi service, and Uber and Lyft are just taxi services with an app, is the cost of the driver. And so labor cost is always going to be the main thing that limits your ability to provide more service. And the question becomes then, how efficiently can you provide that service? And when you look at Uber, Lyft, or taxi, or paratransit is what the transit agencies provide for people with disabilities. All of those types of services that are door to door, they really max out at about 5 riders per hour is what they can do in terms of people they can carry per hour. And low performing in terms of productivity, which is the efficiency term we use in the industry, low performing services and fixed routes are in the range of 10 boardings per hour. The average for the MATA system is about 18 boardings per hour, and Poplar and other routes like that do 25, 30 boardings per hour.
Boardings per hour being
bus running down the street for an hour, how many people are getting on that bus every hour it's running down the street?
Okay.
So you think of an Uber or Lyft driver, why is 5 the maximum? Well, somebody calls up an Uber, they show up, you get in the car, you drive 10 minutes down the street, you get out, they go get another. The maximum they can really do is 5 an hour, realistically. And when they've piloted doing Bridge in Kansas City, they've really only done about 1 or 2. So you still run into this, what we call a gulf in productivity level of they can't really match most fixed route service. So they could have a role in the really lowest density area where fixed routes probably can't achieve more than 5 boardings per hour. But even in most places in Memphis, fixed routes can do better than that.
Can I broaden that out a little bit? Because I've been starting to have these conversations with our MMDC partners. Getting people future ready, which is thinking about Uber and Lyft, but it's also a lot broader than that. There are 4 kind of topic areas. One is infrastructure. We're not paying for infrastructure like we used to. As a consequence, somebody like Memphis, that has as many lane miles as New York City, is having a hard time even keeping up with their potholes, much less any kind of system improvements, right? On top of that, and that's not going to change anytime soon, and so that's kind of an incredible disruption to our transportation. On top of that, you look at technology. Uber and Lyft are the front end of a spear where you have bike share, you have Zipcar that we use to get here today. You have lots of options coming on the table, and what we don't have a clear sense of yet is exactly how they will all work together and start to fit out different markets. But what we know is transit is that big efficient hub for part of it.
And when you talk about the change in funding, is that really, were you talking about the federal funding that has gone away, or are you talking about funding at all levels?
So funding primarily at state and federal levels, which is generally half or more of our infrastructure funding. Caps on gas taxes have been in place for decades. Federal money, same thing, and no will. But 2 others just to kind of put on the table. One is demographics. The system we built was built for boomers. And what we have now is 50% of the workforce that are millennials that have very different expectations about everything from where they live to where they work. and what that works like. And that's going to start driving some real change in how we make arrangements on mobility and a lot of other things.
We just 2 minutes left here. Bill, you want to get in?
Yeah, just a quick question. For many of us here in Memphis, we can get someplace in about a half hour, maybe 45 minutes. Can bus transportation ever match that, or is it a matter of getting close to that?
We have some fantastic maps that we'll have in the report at memphis3.0.com/transit that will show where you can get from 15 different points in the city within an hour's time around Memphis with the redesigned transit system. The amount of jobs you can access, and in reverse, if you're a business, how many people can access your destination. In the case of the medical district, how many new employees can suddenly get there in a half hour's time, 45 minutes, and 60 minutes? Do you have some averages across the system?
I don't have any averages across the system, but I think the maps will say a lot about, how travel times can be improved across the city with the system. There is a certain limit you reach, though, in certain parts of the city. In more suburban parts of the city and outlying areas around the city, the land use is very difficult for walking, and most people walk to transit. So when you look at the total travel time, it can be much more competitive with people going to denser, busier places.
We're going to give you the last word because we're out of time, but we will certainly be talking about this again in the coming weeks and months and years. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for being here. Join us again next week. Good night.